Sonic Boom Episode 26, Counterproductive. We start out with Tails narrating Sonic and Knuckles' stupid Stay Awake challenge. Sticks commentates that Sonic is jogging in circles to stay awake, while Knuckles is watching TV. There's very predictable humor as Knuckles says TV is never boring, and then he sees Comedy Chimp interviewing a news reporter who has a book about fixing your own mistakes. Knuckles remembers when he stole someone's baskets to walk on them so he could be taller. I didn't even know it was a flashback at first, I thought it was just cutting ahead in time. So Knuckles calls himself counterproductive. Because it's a forced comedy, he screams melodramatically that he's a monster multiple times instead of just being sad. He can't find the civilian he bothered earlier, and he picks up an apple and topples some baskets. He then finds him and says he's here to make it up to him. The guy says that he's now got a wife and a job digging up ancient artifacts. So he tries to turn him down, and Knuckles throws his lunch in the water and says he'll get him something special. He throws a basket at him and makes him drop and break his thing, and he moves his stuff off the table and makes the same thing happen. Then somehow, after he got him a great lunch, he reveals that he ate it on the way here, and he somehow continues bothering the guy when he's on archaeological dig, somehow all by himself. If he's doing this on purpose, he's a real asshole. But it would make more sense for him to do it on purpose than to somehow be this stupid. And not even feel guilty about it. He trips and slips on his tool, and Knuckles insults the working conditions. With the guy having bandages on his head, he comes home to his wife, and his wife reveals that she had been convinced to let Knuckles stay for dinner, so she looks like an idiot. This is SpongeBob style of humor, where the main character, who's supposed to be sympathetic, is just tormenting a character, and somehow not realizing they're being annoying. I'm guessing Knuckles proceeded to cause trouble, and somehow do that by accident too. This episode is just the same thing over and over again, humiliating Knuckles instead of making it realistic by having him give up on this. I'm at least proud of him for having the self-awareness and decency to feel guilty about being counterproductive, but no Knuckles in the history of the series has been this counterproductive. And even Boom Knuckles isn't usually this bad. Usually whenever he tries to be competent, he succeeds because he's good at fighting badniks. It's just making him this way for the sake of an episode-long joke. Basically, the story is going to be the same joke over and over again, but told in a creative new way every time, but it's all basically padding that can be skipped with no real loss. Later on, we see that Knuckles picked up all the flags in the dirt, which were marking the locations of valuable artifacts that Charlie somehow knew the location of ahead of time. Then Knuckles shoots a mountain with a ray gun and causes an explosion and rubble. So Charlie gets fired, even though everything was Knuckles' fault. Then because he already called his wife about this, she throws a briefcase of his stuff at him when he gets home and tells him that he needs to stand up for himself. So basically she's mad at him instead of Knuckles, because he could have just told him to get lost a lot earlier and avoided all this. And logically he would've. It was cool to see him laugh maniacally at night and plan his revenge with a weapon. Then he uses a mecha from the time of the ancients to keep the heroes from moving. Other than the fact that they can blink and snarf at him just fine. Somehow. After I'm disappointed by him not being able to do anything, he does shoot a laser at them. But somehow he just leaves laughing evilly after that. Then he cuts in front of Knuckles and takes his burger, and Dave says that this line is for paying customers only to Knuckles instead. I guess because he is part of a gang after all. Knuckles gets ice cream sent at himself, and gets stuffed and kicked around in a garbage can. I actually love seeing this, because he did stuff to deserve this. His friends lecture him to stand up for himself. They shouldn't have to lecture Knuckles to stand up for himself. And then he reveals that he's enlisted the help of a cop to talk to Charlie, because he somehow thought that was a good idea. How could the cop do anything against it? So of course he takes off. But the fact that he dropped something in front of him that he needs is stupid. Nothing forced him to do that. Knuckles somehow convinced himself that Charlie wants to be friends with him after all this. So he gets the pie stuffed in his face, and himself stuffed in the trash can, and gets kicked away by the mecha. I love seeing this too. Amy reads the news reporter's book, which says that if the person you wronged was a supervillain, you don't have to make it up to them. So Knuckles stands up to him all bravely, although it was really lame when he said that name calling is not cool. He jumps over some lasers and runs into him to send the mecha at the staircase. He gets sent away by a laser shockwave against the ground, I guess, as dramatic music plays. He uses a garbage can lid to reflect the laser back of the mecha's arm and make it fall over. The most interesting part of this dodge fest fight. And Charlie inconveniences Knuckles, and eventually Knuckles jumps on top of the mecha and sends him out of it. If the writer knew that it ended when it was just starting to get good, he should have had it last twice as long, not had Eggman lampshade it. This is the hint to the writer that you're supposed to start cutting. How about cut out the whole scene with Knuckles with his wife in his kitchen? His wife is somehow proud of him for getting a new job as a supervillain, and they laugh evilly right after he was reluctant to ignore the truce he made with Knuckles, so make up your mind already. But it kinda makes sense that his wife would keep supporting him anyways, because 1, she's his wife, so she just loves him that much apparently. And 2, her being mad at him for not standing up for himself could be reinterpreted to mean that she's the type of person who would be okay with him getting revenge for himself and hurting Knuckles' feelings. It's hard to have this make sense. But to be fair, I know nothing about this woman. I didn't even get to see her whole scene with him and Knuckles because it cut ahead in the video and somehow that mistake wasn't corrected before being uploaded. So while it comes out of nowhere, it was our mistake to assume she would be a normal person and wouldn't approve of him being a supervillain. And he made a great one, way better than Dave, because that was a cool looking mecha. And I'm glad there was a villain other than Eggman for a change. And he was a sympathetic one that the writer bothered to give a good excuse to. Knuckles ruined his life because he felt guilty about being a nuisance and couldn't stop trying to make it up to him. The whole plot of this episode is that somehow Knuckles keeps screwing things up for him and doesn't give up. Somehow he doesn't tell him to take off after the first time he bothered him, without even implying that he's afraid Knuckles would beat him up for it when he's not a violent hothead in the show. So this was pretty forced. I could buy him not being able to resist the temptation to eat the delicious lunch he bought for Charlie, but I can't buy him picking up all of those flags, and I don't really understand how he managed to make that explosion by accident. So it was really satisfying when Charlie got his revenge on him. Normally I hate seeing Knuckles humiliated, but because he deserves it at this point, I couldn't get enough of him being stuffed in the trash where he belongs. I don't think he ever apologizes to Charlie for anything he did. That's just unrealistic of a heroic character to do, especially when he's trying to make things up to him. And yet he's not decent enough to say sorry? I guess the writer thought that would diminish the humor value because it'd make Knuckles more sympathetic and relatable. And God forbid that happened. We already had a whole comic book of that. It was cool to see Charlie be such a great villain in basically every way. It'd be boring if his laser didn't paralyze and instead was just a normal laser, because then it'd have to be dodged every time to avoid it being unkid friendly. Or giving us harmless, cartoonish slapstick that's too dark and edgy for the show to handle. The problem with the action scene was that 99% of it was literally just Knuckles dodging the laser. It ended too early, but if that was all it was gonna be about, then I'm glad it ended. It made Charlie look really unintimidating when he paralyzed the heroes just to unparalyze them and walk away. If this were any other villain, like any Robotnik other than the Boom one, he would have had the heroes completely at his mercy and killed them right there. How are the heroes not terrified? How are they just calmly snarking about their situation? They didn't know they were gonna be fine. They're used to Boom Eggman, but they don't know how someone else will be. But it was a testament to how Charlie's not as evil as he could be, that all he did with the mecha was bully Knuckles like a thug as opposed to stealing or killing or even injuring. Of all the things he could have done, he has enough moral restraint and respect for the law that he just stuffs Knuckles in the trash a bunch. And somehow Knuckles needs people to tell him to stand up for himself. As if his entire character isn't normally standing up to Sonic. Something I always found weird about this mecha though is that if the Ancients were advanced enough to make it, then how did it ever get left behind in the first place? Why wasn't it still in use by this point? Who in their right mind would abandon it? Also, the only way the Ancients being that futuristic while this time period is stuck having TV sets from the 80s makes sense at all, is if the futuristic technology was isolated to one culture refusing to share, who conveniently weren't interested in trying to take over other countries, and thus spread their technology. And either they all die from something like a natural disaster that happened too fast for them to predict and avoid, or they went to another universe, like the Echidnas did to escape nuclear radiation. The problem with the former idea is that even with our modern technology, we can predict natural disasters just fine and evacuate. Granted, a certain hurricane that hit New Orleans still hit it instead of everyone having evacuated just in time, but maybe our technology didn't predict that and evacuation was too slow. But that's just modern technology. Futuristic technology would be able to predict any disaster and prepare for it. not have their entire culture wiped out. They'd have to spectacularly fail to end up all wiped out if they're advanced enough to have mechas. If anything, the ancients would have wiped out everyone else. So logically, it has to be that they went to another universe instead. We've already seen that other universes exist, and so can crossing to other universes. But wait, it can't be that they went to a parallel universe, because Boom established that dumb, convoluted rule that if you're in a universe where another version of you exists, you'll start glitching out of existence like a faulty program. Somehow without dying on the first glitch out. That rule was so stupid I forgot about it. So it's gotta be that they just went to another planet. Not necessarily another universe. Because they'd have to get really lucky to find and go to another universe where none of them have counterparts that also has room for them to move to without conflict. So the point is, maybe it makes sense that no one went to retrieve this mecha before Charlie and all that time, because the ancients who made it left the planet from being fed up with how primitive and antagonistic every other culture was. And no one else knew about the mecha but them until he rediscovered it. Basically, this episode was frustrating until Charlie started getting his revenge. Were we supposed to root for him? The villain? Well, whatever gets me to enjoy the episode. Sonic Boom episode 26-2. It takes a village to defeat a hedgehog. Oh great, this sounds like another episode where the villagers all turn on Sonic. It was amusing the way a stuffy sounding person said, "Dr. Eggman, why have you called us here?" Eggman invited the Lightning Bolt Society to his meeting room. Unfortunately, Charlie's with them. Did the writers change their minds about the rule against continuity? Good. I guess the fan backlash got to them. Anyways, how did Eggman take this long to recruit these guys for himself? I always thought of them as the discount Drat group, and now they're finally living up to their potential as an Eggman fanboy club. The Legionnaires working for Eggman never worked because they had their entire history, centuries worth of history, as independent villains. But these guys in Drat worked better because Drat only got formed as a response to Eggman, and the Lightning Bolt Society reminds me of Drat. So all Eggman has to do is give them cybernetics with bombs in them, and he's got himself some servants. I love the dramatic music plays when Shadow shows up and the camera slowly pans up, taking him completely seriously. It was pretty cool. Again, I would have been a lot more hyped about this if this came as a surprise, but instead I was spoiled that Shadow would show up in this show. Then Eggman immediately makes things stop being cool by fanboying over him, when no Eggman I know would fanboy over anybody. He'd be way too confident in himself, and have too much dignity. But this guy immediately makes things lame. Eggman's an excited fanboy over Shadow, and calls him a rogue, revealing that for the sake of respectable originality and creativity, and simplifying his backstory at long last, Boom Shadow is still a villain in this universe. And for all we know, he still wants to destroy the world for Maria and just hasn't had a way to do it yet. I'm glad I'm getting a new take on his character. It'd be so boring and redundant if he had the same backstory and personality when we could have something else. And it wouldn't make quite as much sense because there's no indication that this Boom world that he's living on even has an America full of humans that could let him have access to an Eclipse cannon in Maria in the first place. But I'm sure that same plot could have happened with just Mobians instead of humans. I like the idea of him being a villain here because he was a villain in SA2 when he was at his best. And his design perfectly suits him being a villain. And I'm sick of his generic, grim anti-hero shtick. It's time for something new, even if that something new is just one-dimensional villain. At least that's a new interpretation for Shadow. That immediately made me engaged and interested in him for the first time since SDC Online, which I wouldn't have been if he was a boring game Shadow. But I really hate that Eggman said the word canon. Fuck fourth wall breaking! That was the worst one ever, completely taking you out of the scene. A scene that was really intriguing before Eggman ruined it. The Lightning Bolt Society start bickering amongst themselves because one of them is called out on his own incompetence. Barker says that one of them said objection when not in court because he's the type of pedantic asshole no one likes. And Dave thinks he should be the leader even though Eggman's there. It was interesting that one of them stole the cupware even after saying it was barely worth stealing. So he's a kleptomaniac. Eggman tells them to start doing trust falls to start trusting each other. How out of character for Robotnik. And Shadow doesn't catch Eggman. It kinda makes sense that they wouldn't immediately respect Eggman and want him to be their leader, if only because he's evil. But they're evil too, so that's hypocritical of them. I forget, why is Shadow even here? Isn't he supposed to be an independent villain? Why would he go to Eggman in the first place? He doesn't explain himself. Eggman painfully wastes our time by having them say zip and zop, and Shadow doesn't say zop. Finally, he says he's sick of this and starts walking away. Somehow he stops when Eggman gibbers like an idiot instead of running away at super speed like I was begging him to. And he says they're wasting his time and warps away. I wish he warped away way earlier. Sonic's friends are wasting time with an entity I can't follow or relate to. Knuckles breaks a board, and they have to pack them all up in a box. Eggman compliments Shadow for being edgy after he's gone, and the guy disguised as a tree, why is he always disguised as a tree, even when he's not out in public? He says they have blind loyalty and can achieve anything, so suddenly they are blindly loyal to him? But they're bickering when he didn't want them to before. Amy gets spun around a nail somehow, the mecha guy shoots holes in cardboard cutouts of the heroes in a boring montage where the villains do training, and then Eggman shows up at Sonic's house in a mecha. Sonic tells Tails to do an aerial survey, which he somehow understands to mean with his plane, when this would have been a perfect opportunity to have him do it with his tails. And it'd be so much easier and quicker for him to just fly with his tails. And he gets followed by a flying robot. The heroes run away from a laser from the yellow machine, and Amy and Styx get surrounded. And a machine with spider legs attacks something, making some civilians run away screaming, so one of the heroes gets sent towards it. Sonic gets some robots in Eggman's machine sent at him, and that makes him alarmed and remark that he's gotta be kidding him. He's such a wuss because he's used to Boom Eggman. Any other Sonic would be cocky and obliterate them all with a spin attack. Amy gets hit by something from behind, and Styx gets hit by a burger, and Knuckles gets splashed with ink. Then Sonic lures the machine to stomp on one end of a seesaw, which sends him into the mecha in spin dash form. Then Shadow reminds me of how ridiculously evil his voice sounds now. But it suits this Shadow, who insults Eggman for still not beating Sonic. They keep spin dashing at each other, and Shadow gets sent through the house's wall, and Shadow looked really badass and threatening when he grabbed Sonic by the neck or scarf and warped away, because I kinda went, oh crap, and thought about how if this was realistic, he'd break his neck right here, if he could just grab him like that. He brings Sonic upwards and throws him to the desert. That's merciful. How does Eggman assume Sonic was defeated already and take a selfie when Sonic was intact and sitting down? Sonic attacks Shadow because of Eggman's distraction, and the other heroes start succeeding. Shadow says that he can't beat Sonic with Eggman distracting him, so instead of warping Eggman away and continuing the fight, he warps away saying he'll see him soon. But since this ends up with the heroes throwing the Eggmobile to each other like a volleyball with Eggman's in it, as if they have super strength, I guess Shadow actually planned for this to happen. But realistically, if Shadow wanted to beat Sonic so badly, and he has Chaos Control, why didn't he just freeze time and effortlessly kill Sonic? This is Shadow versus Cosmo all over again. If someone as overpowered as him wants to kill someone, he'd just do it. In seconds. There couldn't be an entire story about it. He spent the whole episode holding back. I guess that he would need Eggman's help getting to Sonic's house, and so that was the delay. Wait, Sonic's famous. He could easily find out where it was, on his own. Just ask around. So we could just run up to him before he'd be ready, and while he's reacting all surprised to seeing him, he would just snap his neck. He could kill Sonic in his sleep easily if he really wanted to. So for this plot to not be completely forced at the foundation, it has to be that his real goal isn't to kill Sonic. What he really wants is to have fun beating Sonic up while Sonic's conscious of it. And if he was asleep or frozen in time during that, it'd take all the fun out of it. Problem is, I can't imagine Shadow having fun when he's being totally serious the whole episode. Thank God the show had the decency and dignity to take Shadow seriously. At least aside from one disgustingly fourth wall break from Eggman. I don't see a reason to be angry about Shadow being a villain here. Who cares if he's not a hero in every single one of Sonic's dozen continuities? I'm just glad they're taking him seriously. They show restraint for once. My problem is that we weren't even given a vague hint of what his backstory is. The writer showed self-awareness of Shadow by having Eggman say that he's one of the series' most popular characters. So if it's operating on meta logic, and that's the whole reason he's here, then it has to be that Shadow has the same Maria gets killed backstory, and we're just supposed to assume that because this is supposed to be Shadow the Hedgehog, as the game fans remember him. So that's his whole appeal. And Shadow fought Sonic in SA2 and Generations, not to mention his own game. So I can understand the writers thinking they had to make him fight Sonic and thinking that that's what Shadow does. But it makes me sad and frustrates me that instead of getting their creative juices flowing and thinking of a new backstory for him to explain why he wants to fight Sonic and why he showed up out of nowhere when he wasn't around earlier, like the writers of SCC Online did perfectly fine because they're Sonic fans, instead the writer cares so little about him that he just uses him as a prop to appease the fans. Look, here's a Shadow. He's gonna fight Sonic, because that's what wild shadows do. But if you assume that he's out for revenge for Maria, just like in the game, which we haven't been told he isn't, then him still being evil makes perfect sense. He just hasn't learned his lesson yet. Why would he? There's been no indication he's fought a bio-lizard. And maybe there's no lesson. Maybe in the Boom universe, Maria didn't give a speech about being good for the world when she was just about to get killed, go figure. Instead she would have just said goodbye. Not gone on a big dramatic speech about being good to humanity when she could get killed at any moment. It'd make more sense for her to make a speech about the opposite out of resentment and wanting him to avenge her. That's why I can never blame Shadow for assuming she wanted him to get revenge. Because realistically most people would want that. But even then, for him to assume Maria wanted the entirety of civilization destroyed is going so overboard that they had to explain it as Gerald controlling his memories to avenge Maria for him. Because otherwise that'd just be delusional of Shadow. And stupidly they just kept it to the Japanese script. So logically, what's most likely to be Shadow's backstory is that Maria got killed somehow, and realistically he didn't get given a speech about being a hero for humanity, and so he was left with nothing but resentment and fear of humanity. So he went berserk on everyone he saw afterwards because he was traumatized enough to see everyone as a potential murderer. Maybe the person who killed Maria was someone who looked like any normal person, and thus did so without him expecting it, and so he stopped trusting normal people because they might be a crazed gunman too. So he got locked up for being violent, and he broke out of prison, and just then did he come to Eggman's base to pick a fight with Sonic for stress relief, out of resentment for him trying to keep people alive and unmiserable when all of those people are just potential murderers to him. And the reason he's not explaining this reasoning to Sonic is because he doesn't trust him not to dismiss it and try to talk him out of it, because he didn't have his life. The problem is, how did he ever get locked up? This is a guy who can warp whenever he wants without a Chaos Emerald. Fortunately, it hasn't been established that he can freeze time, so for now I can just assume he can't do that, and that's why he didn't instantly beat Sonic to death in the blink of an eye. But we're missing a step here. That was a plot hole in SA2 as well. How did he go from being in a pod heading for Earth to trapped in a chamber for 50 years? Anyone who'd track him down would easily get killed at worst, and warped away or ran away from it at best. I guess eventually Shadow got really unlucky and got smacked in the head when he wasn't expecting it. Anyone can be caught off guard and given a cheap shot. Maybe he went to sleep for the night and some soldiers tied up and captured him, and he was in prison before he could wake up. That has to be it. In SA2 anyways. But in Boom, that didn't get to happen because we're not told that he woke up from a 50-year nap and who found him. We know it wasn't Eggman, so there goes our only chance to have that explained. So what seems to be making more confusing is really just the show simplifying things. Maybe Boom Shadow isn't from 50 years ago, and lost Maria really recently. After all, we were never told he was that old, or there would be jokes about it, showing him really out of date. Maybe she got killed recently, and that's why he's stressed out enough to think Sonic should be beaten. Things would make so much more sense if we just got told that he was a Shadow android. Then it'd be so much simpler because we'd know where he came from and why he was willing to work for Eggman. But then he'd have no reason to be antisocial. His whole reason for his uncooperative, untrustworthy behavior in Eggman's base, and his whole reason for ditching Eggman for his incompetence. But Eggman has Orbot and Cubot with free will, so it'd make just as much sense for him to have a Shadow android that betrays him. Also, Shadow can't really be that serious about beating Sonic because, well, one, he'd kill him in seconds, but two, I know I saw a clip of him fighting Sonic at one point. Maybe it was in a later episode. And was confused when I saw this episode way afterwards. Why didn't he proceed to keep trying to fight him every day? Why did he just take off to who knows where? No prison could hold a guy who can teleport. I wish Eggman elaborated on why he thinks of Shadow as a rogue, let alone why he is one. Bottom line is, Shadow doesn't really care about anything other than maybe lashing out at humanity for Maria's death, because it turns out that PTSD isn't something you can just get over, no matter what the ending of Shadow the Hedgehog had him say. So this is the actually realistic way for Shadow to end up. He was lucky he even could remember Maria's actual speech after Gerald manipulated his memories, because logically you'd think Gerald would have outright erased that memory. If he could make him think she wanted revenge, he would have erased all evidence that she somehow made a whole speech about being a hero. Really, when you think about it, Shadow even becoming a hero in SA2 was a really contrived, forced, overly convenient Deus Ex Machina for Amy. Amy's actual speech about why he should save the world was terrible. Just, people want to make themselves happy. If anything, that's an argument against humanity. She wouldn't have been able to change his mind. We were lucky he even did in SA2. Boom Shadow must have not had all of that lucky, convenient stuff be the case for him. Also, he doesn't have access to a Doomsday device, so he couldn't try the plan from SA2 even if he wanted to. Maybe the idea that he'd want the world destroyed never occurred to him. After all, he does live on this world, so maybe this Shadow doesn't think it would be worth getting himself killed, which is what would happen if he just warped this planet to the sun, even without him on it, because he still had nowhere else to live and die in space. He wasn't made a mindless agent of destruction who thus wouldn't care about sacrificing himself to achieve that goal. If Boom Shadow wanted to destroy the world, he would have talked Eggman into building a Doomsday device, like the Eclipse Cannon, but instead just agreed to fight Sonic. That's petty. He doesn't have any important goal. He just wants to lash out at everyone. So it sucks that we weren't shown him doing that to establish what his character in the show actually is, aside from just untrustworthy jerk to his own allies who doesn't respect anyone. Instead of us seeing all that worthless padding where the lightning bolt society does pointless training, or catches each other in trust-building exercises no Robotnik would waste his time with. The show could have easily shown a Shadow causing collateral damage, trashing people's shops and stalls while accusing people of wanting to kill him. That would be more than enough to explain the basics about why he's acting out, and what he usually does every day. Instead, most of the episode was wasted on annoying, boring crap. It was cool seeing a genuine action scene where all the heroes were struggling for once. That was exciting to see. I was impressed every single time Sonic struggled in the fight, and it made the moments where he smirked and spin dashed almost cathartic and almost had me rooting for him like it would in a great action scene. Just almost, because he didn't struggle enough. It was very frustrating to see Eggman's dumb behavior all episode. Eggman wouldn't have assumed he won over Sonic that fast. Also, why the hell did he take a selfie instead of taking a picture of Sonic, the actual subject he was celebrating that he wanted to preserve the memory of? Couldn't he have taken a picture of himself and Sonic? What reason did Shadow have to stop fighting Sonic there? Wouldn't it have been better of a villain moment for him if he was continuously punching Sonic while Eggman was doing that? But then Sonic wouldn't have been able to get his second wind and attack him. Or I guess third wind. We could have easily had Knuckles attack Shadow from the side when he was distracted punching Sonic. That could have given Shadow a much better reason to quit the fight. We could have had all of Sonic's friends gang up on him and force him to warp away after they tackle him. Wouldn't that have comedy? Slapstick? No, instead they just humiliate Eggman as a character. First the Metal Sonic episode mostly sucks, and now this. At least Boom Eggman is the most original one, and the most interesting deep character. But why does he have to be so pathetic? It makes more sense when Eggman is a ruler, because why wouldn't someone who can make all those robots and machines be capable of taking over and ruling a place? Do you know how unlucky Eggman has to be to lose to Sonic literally every single time? The point is, this episode sucked until the one good action scene at the end. But at least it didn't literally live up to its name. So what was the point of the name then? I guess it was a reference I didn't get, like one-armed hedgehog. And at least the only fourth wall breaking was one disgusting line. So unlike I assumed, it's not like the whole episode was ruined by being obnoxiously meta. I'm kinda grateful that there's such mystery around Shadow's backstory here, because it got my creative juices flowing by making me use my imagination and work out what his backstory probably is, based on what little we know about him. I enjoyed getting to write that much about what his past could be, but obviously telling us what his backstory is would be better writing. It might seem like a nitpick and unnecessary to ask for, like, oh, it's Shadow. Of course he has the same backstory. We don't need to be told his backstory. But the problem is, well, one, we haven't seen Earth's America on Boom. And two, Boom is exposing a new audience to Sonic. But that audience will be very confused and not learning where the Shadow came from and why Eggman's making such a big deal out of him. Especially because he has Chaos Control. Won't people be wondering why he has that? Why it's not being made more of a big deal out of? He can't have the exact same backstory from SA2, because then why isn't he working for whoever freed him from his capsule and trying to get the world destroyed with them, if Eggman's meeting him for the first time here? And if he already tried that plan and failed, somehow, when he can teleport and move at super speed, why isn't he telling Eggman to build a Doomsday device, if he has the same omnicidal goal and excuse for it as our Shadow? The only answer is that he doesn't have them, or the plot wouldn't be the same. Speaking of Doomsday devices, why didn't Dave just make another one after he got fired by Eggman? He knew how to build the first one, and Shadow didn't go to Dave because he didn't know we could make a Doomsday device. This is why Shadow's confusing, and it's distracting you from the hype at a popular character. There's no attempt to make him a concrete, believable part of the universe, to properly adapt him to that universe, instead of just making him feel like a canon immigrant who jumped from the games into Boom, which desperately needed a serious villain like him. The writer's lack of creative effort to adapt him to this world, while simultaneously making him confusingly petty, betrays his true feelings and how he's only doing this out of obligation to the fans. His feelings where he's half-assed and unenthusiastic about Shadow. I can't imagine being a writer and not explaining why this character the fans don't expect to work for Eggman fight Sonic is doing exactly that in your story. So because the writer was unspeakably lazy, either that or completely ignorant about Shadow, I had to reverse engineer what his new backstory is by removing the parts of the SA2 one that would make this plot not happen. Even then, while I had a lot of fun doing that, if I had to do that, the writer has failed to do his job, which is to write. Maybe he didn't think he had to explain it, maybe he completely took Rise of Lyric's word for it, and assumed that was how Shadow always was, a petty jerk who thinks Sonic's weak because he relies on his friends. But Shadow never taunts him like that in this episode, so it can't be based on that because he doesn't even mention Sonic's friends. I think the writer got all of his knowledge of Shadow from Sonic Generations. Why else would he think of him as just a guy who fights Sonic instead of as a hero? Even then, Generations didn't have him being an untrustworthy antisocial who ditches allies for being annoying. He didn't even have allies. Oh, there's the lack of trust and friendship. I guess he is inspired by Rise of Lyric Shadow. It's not inherently bad for Boom Shadow to get an original interpretation for a change. This isn't the game's Shadow, it's a different one. It's just that it's really lazy and confusing when we're not given details about what his new backstory is, because normally Shadow's entire character is wrapped up in the story of SA2. And even in STC Online, his backstory was the whole reason he was who he was. What writer wouldn't get excited about making a new backstory from him when he can? How uncreative is he? The Shadow is supposed to be appealing entirely to the fans, but why would he think the fans would want him to want to work for Eggman and beat up Sonic just for the sake of it? Yeah, that's original. How could you do research on what the fans think of Shadow in order to find out that he's perceived as an antisocial jerk, and yet not find out that Shadow's a hero? Not another guy who's out to beat Sonic. Did he want to be original or true to what the fans expected? If you want to be true to what the fans expected, have him wield a gun. If you want to be original, go all the way with it and explain it. Don't just be wishy-washy and ambiguous. Do they think the fans would get really angry if they gave Shadow a new backstory, and so it would be too big a risk? Why? Doesn't everyone just complain about his backstory for being too complicated and dark and involving humans? They should have known the fans would appreciate anything better than what we have now. Then again, every time I assume the game purists would appreciate something different from the games for its uniqueness, it seems like there's people who somehow get offended by it anyways. And I know some die-hard Shadow fans would be mad, but most people would appreciate a more simplified backstory. But it has to involve Maria dying, or he'll have no explanation for why he's evil, which would make giving him a backstory completely worthless. And it can't just be Eggman brainwashes him into being his henchman either, because that would just make me wonder why he can't do that to everybody and take over the world, and why he hasn't done that already. It'd be too overpowered of him. All of this trouble because they had to have the real Shadow, not a Shadow android. because that wouldn't be appealing for fan service, and instead be as disappointing hollow fan service as the Illusion Shadow in Sonic Forces. But this isn't the real Shadow either. That's all the more reason they should have given him his own fully fledged backstory so that he could actually seem like the Sonic Boom version of Shadow, as opposed to empty Shadow. That would go a long way towards validating his character, because right now, the only justification we have is all theoretical. By the way, if the writer thought to lampshade that their plans are for plots taking place in just one location with just 8 characters, there's no excuse for them actually doing that. There's no excuse for us not being shown different locations. There's no excuse for not having world building.